charges. But nonetheless, for some period of time, he was facing Computer Fraud and Abuse Act charges for doing exactly that. It's also worth looking at the tragic case of Aaron Swartz, who spoofed his MAC address to download journal articles. That was a Computer Fraud and Abuse Act crime. Andrew Orenheimer, who allegedly conspired to run an automated script to plug in identifiers for iPads and get email addresses. Didn't even do it himself. He's doing several years in federal prison for that. Also worth noting that the Department of Justice has said in their manual about the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act that conspiracy to hack a honeypot can violate the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. There's really no end to the sorts of things that could possibly violate the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. So you're looking at a situation where the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act almost acts as an ex post facto law, where the Department of Justice is able to look at what you did after the fact, and if they don't like it, or they don't like you for whatever reason, you may be trollish for some reason, you are likely to be on the wrong end of a Computer Fraud and Abuse Act prosecution. There's also a civil cause of action provided by the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. So the company that, whoever the target is of this exploit, can also pursue who's ever accessed the system without authorization. So the question then is, is there anything we can do to try to reduce our chances of being on the wrong end of this type of lawsuit? Well, let's take a quick, we don't want to go too far in the statute. It's not a continuing legal education conference, but let's just take a quick look at the statute and see if there's some key words we can at least identify. Here we have, whoever having knowingly access to computer without authorization. Another part of the statute, whoever intentionally accesses a computer without authorization. So one of the things you can do is to try to avoid unintentionally creating knowledge and intent. It's a little bit hard to do this for yourself if you intend to do something, but at least you can avoid doing it in connection with other people. So, for example, I would suggest that you do not direct information about how to use some kind of technique to someone that you suspect or have reason to know is likely to use it illegally. Be careful in providing technical support for some clever new technique that you've developed. So my advice, if I were your lawyer, I would advise you not to answer that tweet if someone's tweeting to you asking you about how to make something more effective, perhaps. This slide's a little more detailed, some more approaches that you might take. Don't provide information possibly directly to individuals, especially if you're not sure who they are or what they might be up to. Consider just posting things on a website only. Do not post information to forums where you suspect or forums that are known to generally promote illegal activity. If you publish it on your own website or you have control of the post, consider disabling comments so you don't have a situation of people discussing potentially illegal uses of your technique. And lastly, don't maintain logs. So one of the things we've seen happen, so that's enough for the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act for now. There's not a whole lot you can really do about it beyond just being careful. Let's move on to a temporary restraining order. This is particularly timely, actually, because you may have read the story about the VW group and the Megamos encryption that was used on the vehicle immobilizers. So some European security researchers had figured out how to bypass or discovered a flaw in the encryption that was used on the vehicle immobilizers that were used in VW group cars like Porsche and Audi and Bentley. And they're going to present this at the Usenix conference in Washington, D.C. in a few weeks. And they got themselves slapped with a temporary restraining order preventing them from making this disclosure at the conference. How did this happen, and how can we prevent this from happening again? We've seen this here at DEF CON and Black Hat talks have been stopped by a temporary restraining order. So take a quick look at the factors that the courts look at when deciding whether or not to grant a temporary restraining order to prevent a researcher from disclosing some information about a vulnerability. Number one, will the requester, so in that case it would be the VW group, suffer irreparable harm if the TRO does not issue? Good evening, sir.
Okay, who knows how this works? See a new speaker? All right, it's really hard to get accepted to speak at DEF CON, right? You guys should all be thinking about how you're going to create talks. I've been drinking all day. Talks to eventually have yourselves up here, right? A big round of applause for Jim. All right, one more order of business. We need a new person who's first time at DEF CON. First hand up right there. Red shirt, come on up on the stage.
We've got a little extra. Let's get one more.
Oh, we're going to get two people. All right, first hand up over there. There we go. All right, there you go. All right, cheers to our new speaker.
Hang on.
All right, let's see if he can pick up where he left off. We're going to work on new material for tomorrow. Thank you.
We do have new material for tomorrow.
Thanks, guys. All right, so that was great. Thank you. All right, just a quick look at some of the factors that the court's going to look at when deciding whether or not to grant a temporary restraining order to someone like the VW group who wants to stop a presentation from happening at Usenix. Will the requester, the VW group, suffer irreparable harm if the TRO does not issue? Pretty easy to imagine. You've got an embedded system and someone's figured out how to break it. It's going to be almost impossible for them to update it in any reasonable amount of time. Usually expensive, probably some irreparable harm. That basically means that money isn't going to fix it very easily. So that goes in VW Group's favor. Will there be an even greater harm to the researcher if the TRO does not issue? What, your paper got delayed? You couldn't put in some part of the algorithm maybe, you had to pare it back. Hard to see that as like a huge harm to the researcher. We might feel really bad about that, but in terms of the huge sums of money VW Group's going to have to pay to fix this, it's not really going to look too good for the researcher there. The public interest. This is kind of a fun one because we might think that, well, the public interest clearly favors disclosing the vulnerability so it can be fixed. The court's probably going to go the other way on that and see that really the risk to all these BMWs or rather Porsches and Bentleys and things being stolen is much greater, is much more in the public interest than having your really obscure crypto talk go forward. The last factor is the likelihood a requester will ultimately prevail. And this is really the one we need to focus on because the VW group has to have a cause of action. They can't just say we don't like it. They have to say, here's why you need to stop, and it's because you did something bad to us. And in the case of the VW group, the Megamo's case, and also in the case of the Cisco disclosure, what we had was the use of copyrighted material. And that's really that was the hook that got the TRO to issue. So the obvious advice then is to avoid the use of copyrighted material. So if you include source code or object code from whatever it is that you're working on, that gives leverage to whoever it is that wants to stop you from disclosing it. There is a fair use exception if you use little bits and pieces of code, but that's a case-by-case analysis, and you can't just say, well, this is going to be fair use. It depends on how much you use and other factors that are very specific to what's actually going on in your case. So just try to avoid it if you can. It may not be possible, but to the extent you can do that. Also avoid darknet sources for wherever you're getting this stuff. In the Megamo's case, the court actually talked about the fact that the researchers obtained some information about how the Megamo system worked through some sketchy channels. I don't recall it saying exactly where they got it, but it was some sort of BitTorrent P2P type thing, wherever they got it. It wasn't from VW Group or Megamos. So another thing you want to do is be aware of pre-existing contractual relationships that you as a security researcher might have with the target of whatever it is you're working on. These contractual agreements could come in the form of a term of service, end-user license agreements, non-disclosure agreements, or employment agreements. So, what's that?
End-user license agreement?
Sure. So an end-user license agreement might very well have provisions in it that prohibit reverse engineering software, for example. And that's something that you might very well be doing as part of your exploration into your technique. And that could give leverage to someone to try to stop using, oh, you've breached this. Nothing's for certain. It's just an argument that they have. It's something, there's not much you can do about it. I mean, pretty much every piece of software you get is going to have some kind of license agreement that's going to, assuming you came to it legitimately, right? You've agreed to this license that may prohibit you from doing certain things with that software, and there's not a whole lot you can do about that. But you at least can be aware of the risk, if nothing else. So how far you need to go in trying to mitigate the risk somewhat depends on the techniques that you've used in your research. If you've done things that are clearly look like some of the examples of what people have done that's gotten them prison time, that's something you need to be careful of, and maybe take more aggressive mitigation techniques in order to perhaps hide some of the information about what you're doing. So for example, if in the Megamos case, no one had identified that it was the VW group that was where this crypto system had been compromised, VW Group would not have been able to issue to go after a temporary restraining order against the researchers. So perhaps there's an opportunity here for the conference-going community to create a track where people could present things that sort of get like a little asterisk or something next to it, and we all recognize that this is something that had to be kept quiet. It's sort of like a confidential disclosure, trust the review board, this is going to be really cool, but we just can't really tell you about what it is because then you won't get to hear it. So maybe that's one approach. So I'd like to talk about some of the ways that you might make a disclosure that are relatively less likely to get you in trouble. You can obviously disclose to the responsible party. That's what we'd like to do. That's sort of what the responsible disclosure paradigm is all about. You found a problem with the system, you tell who's running the system. This is actually, unfortunately, relatively high risk, and that risk scales with the questionableness of whatever technique it was that you used to find out about this vulnerability. So if you were connected to the internet, you accessed a remote system and you didn't have permission, that's how you did it. It may not be a great idea to go tell them about it, because if they don't like it, they've got an action against you. If you're inconvenient, that's a problem for you. You might think you're doing them a favor. They might not agree that you're doing them a favor. If you're able to submit it anonymously to whoever the vendor is or the responsible party, that's great. Depends how good your OPSEC is, I suppose. A lot of times you think you're maybe anonymous, but you're not as anonymous as you thought you were or hoped you were. So that's a risk in itself that you need to consider. If you submit to a bug bounty, presumably they've invited it, maybe you're at less risk. You can disclose to a government authority, perhaps. Maybe you don't really believe it'll ever get to the vendor. But again, if your techniques were perhaps questionable, you might not necessarily want to be submitting it to a governmental authority. You may want it separately. You may have an interest in keeping your own identity anonymous. Again, you can try to submit anonymously to the government, but I don't know how much we can really trust that anymore. Fortunately, this is a legal talk and somewhat legal talk, and you can almost never get to a legal talk where someone